Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is all about how to deliver quality across the entire workflow at the speed of DevOps. My name is Anthony Edwards. I'm the Chief Product and Operations Officer. Justin Trenner, who's Director, Head of QA Vector Research at QA Media, and Greg Egan, who's the Head of Software Engineering at Direct Line, one of the UK's leading digital financial services businesses. So this is the biggest challenge in testing today. How can we release more frequently and yet maintain quality? In fact, not only maintain quality, because user expectations are increasing, we have to release more frequently while improving quality. Meanwhile, systems are becoming more complex so that any real user journey is not simply interacting with one bit of software, but is interacting with a mix of mobile, digital, back office software. So we have to release more frequently while improving quality in a far more complex environment. Wow, no wonder so many teams are finding this difficult. So to help teams answer these questions and create a test strategy and an approach that can deliver quality across the entire workflow at the speed of DevOps, we've been working with QA Financial on some research to understand where most teams are today and what the successful teams are doing differently to make this work. So in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Justin to talk through the research and, most importantly, the key lessons we learned about what teams can do to deliver quality at the speed of DevOps. We're then going to talk to Greg about what Direct Line are doing to deliver quality at speed and learn the secrets of his success. I'm then going to talk a bit about Eggplant's experience of working with customers to develop a new approach to testing that can help meet these challenges. And then finally, we're going to finish up with some questions from the audience and hopefully help you take the lessons you get from this webinar and sort of operationalize them in your own environment. So without further ado, I'm Justin from QA Media to talk about the super interesting research he's been doing into quality at speed. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much, Anthony. We were very excited to be asked by Eggplant to look at how people operationalize their testing across heterogeneous platforms. Most firms that we speak to have some combination of traditional established software and some elements of new approaches, agile delivery, and different technologies as well. The question is, how do you integrate your testing across those platforms? In order to understand people maintain quality right across the workflow, we, in the first quarter of this year, basically in February and March, spoke to 33 technology leaders, major banks, asset managers, insurers, predominantly in Europe and North America, people who were from the CTO to head of DevOps, head of quality engineering, heads of architecture. And we wanted to understand how they ran quality processes across disconnected and heterogeneous technology applications. Key thing we found was that was a challenge. You have established parts of the workflow, you have new build, and there is a risk that problems slip through the cracks. So I'm going to break this down into three elements. What's the overall strategy and priorities that we saw from people we spoke to in terms of development and testing? What is their delivery architecture, and what should they be doing about that delivery architecture? And then how do you measure effectiveness, benchmarking? Starting with the QA strategy and priorities, what we found was that whilst most people are thinking about how to adopt an agile way of working and move to DevOps, at the same time they are very much dependent on traditional waterfall elements of their development and approaches. And that's often led by a safety-first approach. That tends to lead to a balkanized approach to testing. So the next few slides, we explore that issue. So how mature are continuous testing practices? Well, very often, continuous testing is a goal, not a reality. Sometimes there's continuous regression testing so that you can do that quickly, but although 70% of firms say they want to move to continuous testing, the majority of firms still cannot achieve that because a core part, as I've mentioned, of their delivery is stuck in a waterfall process. And that goes against the fact that the vast majority of firms are being pressured to deliver more frequently. So combining that means that you're constantly testing your interconnects. That's a key point of failure. And so that integration challenge, where you can see that firms we spoke to are making new drops as frequently as fortnightly and weekly and more often, whilst they're challenged to increase that frequency, they struggle to achieve that because of the that discontinuity that I've mentioned a couple of times. So that results in redundancy of testing or repetitive testing. It also occurs in part because the testing environment doesn't lend itself, that you have part of what you're doing in the cloud, but part of what you're doing in locally installed or private clouds. So you can't do one continuous test approach. So let's have a little bit more of a look at that infrastructure. What are the challenges we see that arise out of the delivery architecture? Well, if you don't think about workflow in a continuous and integrated way, if you think about your agile parts as separate somehow from your waterfall parts, and even if you have a hybrid approach to your delivery, you still think that really your agility is at the front end. As we can see for more than half of firms, they think agile at the front end, but they think traditional and established at the core mainframe side. You then promote a disconnected approach to testing. Where does that come from? That comes from often a disconnected approach to management, so that up to 85% of respondents have only limited authority over parts of their delivery workflow, which means they don't have the right to get involved in and test those other parts. They don't have, for a third of respondents, 36%, parts of the infrastructure are simply not areas that they're allowed to include in their testing, which means that you can only cover limited slices. So we need to see these agile transformations as part of a larger change context. So if you're going to take a continuous approach and an integrated approach to intelligent automation of your QA, what are the things that are going to get in the way? Well, for a quarter of firms almost, it's just a lack of test data management approach. So test data, often parts of the test data frame belong to different product owners. Often there's a lack of trust between colleagues, and that was quite striking and perhaps even a little surprising. Some people don't see the need, but where it is used, there is a sense that it actually allows you to improve performance and continuously automate exactly as intended. So what you see when you break it down to the detail is that the inhibition on testing is very much driven by, or inhibition on continuous testing is very much driven by management practices that mean that the thought process is compartmentalized, and the thought process being compartmentalized means that the applications used to do the testing are often applied in a compartmentalized way. What does that mean for value stream management? Well, when we look at value stream management, at return on investment, what we discover is that to a degree, most firms that we speak to are very aware of the costs that they incur when they do their testing, but much less aware of the returns. They're aware of specific outcomes, defect leakage, production incidents, whether or not they're reducing their cost or increasing their costs, but they don't have clear quality-led and customer-led outcomes against which they can judge the performance and the solutions. They lack people who can look across the whole workflow in the same way as a customer. So as many as a quarter of firms don't capture feedback from business or customer users of their solutions as part of their quality process. The demonstration of value often lacks an expression in hard key performance indicators that would allow the user to, or rather the tester, to explain the value creation in the user, expressed in the user journey. So when we pull this together, what do we see are key findings, and what are the solutions that go with those key findings? Well, 70% of firms are moving to continuous testing, but they lack good, clear approaches that will allow them to look right across the process. So what's the solution to that? Well, the solution to that is inserting QA specialists into delivery teams in a truly agile way, so that the QA specialist, we hear a lot about shift left, the QA specialist is part of the business requirements definition, defining quality goals and tests that then have a much greater chance of succeeding and passing when you come to the endpoint of delivery to user acceptance, testing and production. So if you initiate Agile, you have to integrate quality assurance and quality thinking into not just the components at the front end that you may think of as Agile, but the underlying infrastructure, because they're all part of delivering what ends up at the front end. If you're going to target Agile-style rhythms of frequency of delivery, you have to make sure that the processes and the thinking around the processes run all the way through. It's not good enough if you can't identify clear targets for the Agile shift. So you have to move on from waterfall-based metrics, how many tests did I run, how many did I pass, how fast can I do, even how much have I automated is only a part of the story. You have to have pay attention to outcomes-based testing, to what is the amount of our time that we're spending remediating versus testing versus new build delivery. What's the efficiency, therefore, of our build process, and how can we show that we are building more efficiently as a result of having a better approach to quality? Part of that is prioritizing. Prioritizing those things which mustn't fail versus those things which are acceptable bugs and can be remediated quietly along the way. We're all used to handheld apps that have mild bugs that we can live with versus payment applications which either work or don't work. And I think part of the story here is attracting the investment, which you will only attract if you can explain to a CFO, never mind a CTO, what the value is that you're going to get from quality assurance. And to do that, you have to be able to show what good looks like. You have to be able to show that you've got joined up thinking that starts at the left and delivers better outcomes more frequently all the way down at the right-hand side. If you want to read more about this, you can actually access a full copy that we've just given you highlights of this research in the resources window on this webinar, or feel free to contact any of us after the webinar. Anthony.
Great, thank you. That was fantastic, Justin. I mean, for me, the most interesting insight there is really that last point. 60%, 67% of teams have no measure for ROI. I mean, maybe that's why it sometimes feels in QA like we're going a bit around in circles, because we don't have that clear direction of what are we trying to achieve. What does good look like? Anyway, thank you, and obviously you'll be back for questions at the end of the webinar. So now I'd like to come back to Greg Egan, who I introduced earlier, is the head of software engineering at DirectLine. It's fantastic to have you with us today, Greg.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great, great. So, I'd actually like to start just by picking up on that point I just mentioned. So 67% of teams don't measure the ROI of testing at all. And as I say, I think that can lead to a bit of a directional vacuum in testing. So, from your perspective, from DirectLine's perspective, what's the purpose of testing, and how do you measure that success?
It's a really great and fundamental question, Anthony. So thank you for that. And I'm quite content that you asked it. So testing, in the kind of my understanding, is a part of a quality assurance process. So the purpose is to answer the questions of if the software is correct, if it's secure, if it's performant, accessible, if it's reliable, and if it's available. So in my opinion, testing should start as early as possible in the whole process. So never end and always keep evolving. If we identify possible quality issues early in the process, it's the most effective and it's the cheapest to get them fixed. So we should be testing if our organization is ready for building software. For example, asking questions if we have the right skills in the organization. We should be testing the requirements with low fidelity prototypes. So we're testing architecture design and decisions. So early on in the process, we should already start testing many of the assumptions. So once we get to writing the code, we need to continuously validate the code. We need to continuously validate the code using a variety of engineering techniques. And we should also be testing our process of how we're building that software, all the time, asking ourselves questions if there is anything we could do better, or if there are things that we should stop doing. So, this is the kind of a general answer to what the testing is and how we understand the question, but the testing. But to answer your second part of the question, how do we measure the output of the testing? It's not that great, to be honest. Anecdotally, we could talk easily for minutes and hours about the systems that are low in quality, because those systems are typically the ones that are causing us operational headaches. So by this I mean incidents and issues in production. So some of the data that we could retrieve from the incident management systems could be used to try to quantify that, but it's not that easy to correlate that data with the testing effort. A lot of testing in many legacy systems is manual as well, so it is even harder to conclude whether the amount or effort of testing pays off with quality, with improved quality of the underlying software or the underlying system. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does indeed. And it's, as you say, the breadth of what we talked about there, right? It's sort of, you got the functional testing, as I think everyone knows, but then we talked about non-functional, we talked about testing the process, and even then going into production and looking at operational incidents. I think that sort of highlights all the different challenges of testing. Now, as I think about kind of operational incidents, now obviously you guys at DirectLine are in a highly competitive online space. Obviously financial services, but retail financial services. So, your digital experience must just be critical to your business. And so, as you think about testing and you think about quality, it's not just that sort of, sort of checking the software against the spec and, can I tick the box? You're really trying to make sure you're delivering a great customer experience, and obviously reducing operational incidents is a key part of that. So, have you found it, does it change how you think about testing when you think about it, not just so much as, compliance testing, did I implement the spec correctly, but really thinking in terms of how do I deliver a fantastic customer experience. Has that changed how you do testing?
Absolutely. It does change how you do testing. So as I mentioned previously, testing in the early phase of software design and development is absolutely crucial. So we're starting by we collecting a lot of customer feedback from our sparse call centers and from our colleagues on the front line who have day-to-day contact with the customer. And that feedback is combined with some targeted customer interviews, and some business ideas are being formed for the change, for the new requirements. So it's just the beginning of a process, but then what happens is we build a low fidelity prototypes, and we're trying to validate those ideas doing more targeted customer interviews and customer testing. So after getting into the stage where these aspects are confirmed, the requirements are corrected, we're getting into building some more functional prototypes. So those prototypes quite often are built in to be production ready. So they tick off all the boxes when it comes to the performance, the accessibility, and so on. Once we distribute the software, we include the software has a built-in analytics. So we collect a lot of metrics about the customer experience itself. And of course, we continuously collect the feedback from the customer by our frontline colleagues. So this all is only possible thanks to the quick development cycle. I mean, obviously, development and release. And in my opinion, the excellent customer experience is defined by a capability to respond to feedback and change quickly. So that is why what you've been talking about yourself and Justin about agile and lean practices with software development are quite essential. And the software engineering practices go along with it as well.
Yeah, no, I think, as I'll talk about a bit later, I think the most important thing in testing is to make sure that whatever testing process you have, it starts with customers and users, and so few people do, right? Most people, their testing process starts with requirements, which they probably don't really even have or are a bit unclear, and so few testing processes really put the user and the customer at the center of their testing, and it's amazing that you guys have done that. And you talked about bringing that information from production back into development, and obviously your role at Direct Line's not focused specifically on testing; it's all of development. So, how do you guys integrate sort of development and operations? I mean, do you have a structured way of doing that? Are you bringing data from production, either profiling data or user journey data or defect data? Do you have a structured approach to bringing data back from production into the development cycle, or is that done more through just ad hoc people meetings, or how does that work?
I think for this particular aspect, we need to consider the largest part of organization, and the fact that something that Justin was talking about is not the entirety of the organization that works in the same way. You have parts of organization which work in more agile ways, where there's also parts which work in more waterfall ways, or just more slightly different, more traditional approach to software development. Now, with the more modern approaches, the metrics from operations teams, metrics from the operational running of software are directly fed into a product team, and that product team has a owner of the product that they build and deliver, and they can see the impact of their changes on the customer based on those telemetrics that come from analytics. That's the direct technical feedback that then combined with the interviews and indirect feedback that comes through via a variety of sources. So that's correlated from our customers, from our call centers, from websites that you can go and just submit feedback. All of that feeds into a team and into a product owner who then builds hypotheses on what needs to change, what needs to happen based on that feedback and on the technical metrics. And they design the next incremental change to the software, which then gets prioritized and of course, is being put on the backlog for the team to work on. Now, this is of course for digital space. That's the normal way of working, and that's how you would expect modern software to happen these days. Unfortunately, the real life meets reality, and a lot of the systems are legacy systems don't work that way. There's a lot of they operate in more waterfall way. They're quite detached from the actual end customer. So for this, I would more traditional approach is still in place.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Just thinking about some of that. Lots of things. I think, especially as I think about dev and ops working together, I mean, continuous delivery is obviously a key trend at the moment, and a lot of organizations, people love to talk about how many times a day they release, right? And the more you release, the cooler you are, and sort of you sort of feel like people are constantly one-upping. And I mean, these days, if I talk to someone who's releasing once a month or once a fortnight, they're kind of embarrassed and they mumble it down because they sort of don't feel cool. At the same time, I'm hearing loads of users complain that they hate how often apps get updated, and that every time they open an app, it seems to have to go and update itself before they can use it. So clearly there is a balance, and obviously it's going to depend on the kind of app you're providing. So I guess question to you is, I mean, how often are you guys releasing your updates? I think it's also interesting for people to hear what did that journey look like? Did you just go from sort of once every 6 months to once every day or once a week, or did you go through several iterations? And how did you decide what the right cadence of delivery is for Direct Line?
It's quite a complex topic, and it is really probably a webinar by itself. But we have quite many different systems and different solutions in place. So release cadence varies throughout all of those, between 4 times a year to a few times a week. And we have some places where we have multiple times a day releases. But cadence is influenced by many factors. So one of them, which is quite relevant to our discussion, is validation of quality for the release candidate, which means, of course, we need to do some testing. So if the majority of the testing is automated, the release happens multiple times a day. If it's manual, it happens infrequently. So if the changes are if we have a changes of one of our core legacy systems where many dependencies on those systems could be impacted, and automation testing is low level. There's not a lot of automated tests for those core systems. Then the releases are very infrequent. So the ability to tell that proposed release candidate is the correct, that it doesn't break all the systems that depend on it, it's secure, the release candidate is performant and accessible. So these to answer those questions, these are the factors that influence release cadence. So in general, I would say that good cadence is as often as needed. But the caveat in all of that is it should not impact customer. It doesn't matter if it's internal customer or external customer. If the release needs to happen, so your cadence should be as often as you need to change your software or your system, that's a good cadence, but you have to pay attention to not impact the customer.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting that you guys have such a range, so everything from 4 times a year to multiple times a day. So, you know, as you say, even within an organization, there's going to be different answers depending on the application, either from the customer side or, as you say, from how automated the testing is. That's great. So thank you very much, Greg. I think that's probably what I've got time from the interview side of it. So I'm going to just sort of pause you there. I know you're going to be back a bit later for some questions at the end of the webinar, but thank you very much. That was fantastic.
That's okay. My pleasure.
Now I'd just like to quickly introduce some innovative work we've been doing at Eggplant in close collaboration with our customers across the sort of financial services industry to really create a whole new approach to testing that really focusing a lot of the things we've been talking about today, both Greg and Justin, and we call it customer-driven testing, and we believe that this is core to delivering high quality at the speed of DevOps. So, you know, I'm going to start with 2 numbers from a survey, actually a different survey, 11% and 18%. 11% in this survey, which went across over 500 enterprises, was the percentage of teams that said they were able to keep up with the pace of DevOps. So only 11% of teams are saying they can keep up with DevOps. 18% is the number of teams who are delivering their desired customer experience. So there's 18% is the percentage of teams saying we think we're doing a good job. We're delivering what our customers need. Now, this isn't great, obviously. We're quite far from where we want to be. But maybe if we're just at the beginning of DevOps and beginning of our UX journey, maybe this is okay. By the way, slight caveat here, I always like to add, people are generally not where they think they are on this scale as well. As this result from Bain showed, 80% of CEOs believe that they're delivering a superior customer experience, but only 8% of their customers agree. So before you get too confident about where you are on this, it's probably good to check. So we're very low in terms of keeping up with DevOps and delivering a high CX, but if we're at the beginning of that journey, that's okay. But unfortunately, there's an increasing amount of evidence suggesting that these low achievement rates are not simply because we're at the beginning of the journey, but because of some really fundamental flaws in the current approach to testing and test automation. Now, firstly, no one in the survey, when we started digging into it, was on both sides of this equation. No one was able to provide both keeping up with the speed of DevOps and deliver a great UX. So what does this mean? Does this mean that current approaches to test automation simply can't deliver both speed and UX or high quality? Is there some sort of like Kaizen testing principle? Pause that thought. Bit of evidence showing that there are some really fundamental issues is this graph. So this shows test automation rates for the last 10 years. And what it's really telling us is that test automation rates really just aren't increasing. So, you know, they increased a bit very slowly between 2010 and 2014. But really, since 2014 to 2019, it's the same in 2020, test automation rates across the world just haven't increased. Somewhere between 35 and 40% of most people's testing is automated. And actually, you can see that over the last 2 years, it's even been getting worse. So, you know, all these people sort of just getting their frameworks in place, thinking, well, if we can just get to this next level, you know, sort of we'll be good, we'll be done, we can get to 100%. It's not true. There's something wrong. And we believe that these low achievement rates are exactly because of some fundamental flaws in the current approach to testing and test automation. And until we address those, we're just not going to improve. So we decided to get a better understanding of the key factors for teams that were able to achieve these goals. So if we look at the people who are able to keep up with DevOps, unsurprisingly, they had very high levels of test automation, and something Greg talked about in terms of delivery cadence. They tended to be standalone applications. They tended to be sort of things where you controlled the whole domain. They didn't have lots of integration points. They weren't compositions of lots of different things. Similarly, they tended to be sort of more traditional, maybe monolithic business-to-business apps, and they were very mature. So that were the key factors in the 11%. In terms of the 18% of companies that were able to deliver their desired CX, the key thing there was, I'll give you all a second to see if you can guess, but the key thing was manual exploratory testing. Now that's interesting. So I think this really, at least for me, really helps explain the problem. No wonder no one can achieve both speed, keeping up with that pace, and high quality. It's because the critical success factors are really the exact opposite. It's automation for DevOps and it's manual testing for UX. So no wonder people are able to keep up as well in DevOps, given that, you know, standalone monolithic applications, very mature, don't change much. No one has that environment anymore. And if you step back, what this is really saying, I think, is that manual testing is intelligent, so it can deliver a high customer experience. You know, good manual testers, they know which feature was rushed in at the last minute. They know what are the things that people tend to complain about to the support queue if they go wrong. What's the bit of the what's the architectural bit of the application that never quite worked properly? They really know how to apply intelligence to the testing, but they're slow and they don't scale. Automation, on the other hand, is really fast, but it's not clever. If you're running automated tests and they find defects in one area, what do? Do they stop and look for more defects in that area? No, they just keep going as they were and go on to whatever they were told to do. And this is really, it all comes down to the fact that currently when we talk about automated testing, what we're really talking about is regression testing. And regression testing is never clever. Whereas manual testing these days tends to be exploratory testing, which is intelligent. So I think if you take all this away, what you get to is, can we come up with an approach that combines the intelligence of manual testing, or manual exploratory testing, with the speed of automation so that it can keep up with DevOps? Basically, can we automate exploratory testing and not just regression testing? Because if we can keep up with the pace of DevOps and deliver a great customer experience. So to answer this question, let's start looking at how good manual exploratory testing works. What is this process that we're trying to automate? So manual exploratory testing starts with a set of all possible user journeys, and that's what these stars on the slide are supposed to be. It's not constrained by a specification or the technology limitations of your automation tools. Everything's in play. Then you get your best testers, as I said, the ones who understand the product, understand how customers use the product and what they're really trying to achieve, and they understand the risky parts of the technology stack in the development process. They know the features that are rushed and they know all this stuff. So you get these testers and they use all this knowledge to choose the user journey that they're going to test to maximize the user experience. And this is really key. Whenever I speak to folks doing manual exploratory testing and I ask them how they decide what user journeys to test, they talk about customer experience and they talk about technical risk. None of them talk about sort of specifications and compliance and this kind of things. They're not testing to prove that it works in some theoretical sense. They're testing to make sure that it works for real users. Also note that these testers are not just looking at functionality, they're also looking at performance and usability. They're empowered to have that opinion beyond the specification because of their knowledge. So manual exploratory testing is able to deliver excellent customer experience because it's focused on the user, not the specification. It leverages a whole set of knowledge about users and risks to focus on the right user journeys and identify CX issues. It looks at functionality, performance, and usability, and it starts with the whole universe of user journeys as its search space, not that tiny subset of unrepresentative user journeys that we happen to have scripted. So that's great, but unfortunately, as discussed, there's also a few problems, and basically just that it's slow and it doesn't scale up. There's also not that many people in the world with these skills. So the challenge is whether we can automate exploratory testing as we've kind of defined and explored it here, so that we can achieve that UX at that speed. And can we do this in a way that works on complex, multi-app, cloud-native, multi-cloud, highly dynamic systems so that we can get beyond that 35% test automation and 11% of teams able to keep up. Of course, it'd be a really, really, really disappointing webinar if the answer wasn't, of course we can definitely do this. And this is exactly what we call customer-driven testing, because fundamentally, like exploratory testing and like all the stuff Greg was talking about earlier, it's focused on the user. It puts users at the center of testing, and we believe that's the key to transforming testing and changing these breaking these ceilings that you saw earlier about automation rates. So very quickly, how does customer-driven testing work? Well, at the center we have a model of the application that we can use to auto-generate different journeys throughout the system. It has to have a model. You can't have these linear scripted tests, because by definition, once you're executing a test, you must have executed it before. You need to have some kind of model-based testing that's able to auto-generate tests that no one's ever executed before. Otherwise, it's not exploratory testing. So it's critical. The second key part is this selection engine. The problem with being able to auto-generate tests is you can auto-generate billions of them in a standard application, but you can't execute that. So which ones do you run? If you can generate 20 billion tests, which 1,000 should you run overnight or on check-in? And the answer is to have an AI-powered selection engine. This is why this really wasn't possible earlier, I think. But now we've got all these great AI technologies and analytics things in the world. We can do this. So a selection engine that takes all this data from users about what's important to them, all this information from Jira, from Git, from your testing so far, to understand where's the technical risk here, what's gone wrong in the past, what have we done this time. Take all that knowledge and decide which of the 1,000 tests I'm going to run to maximize my user experience. And as I said, that needs to not just be the technical risk, but it's got to be taking in information from production as well. And the fourth critical part of customer-driven testing is the tester. All this stuff is all about optimizing and doing testing at great scale, but you still need to have that intelligent tester who can formulate hypotheses, have ideas, and then focus the whole testing setup in the right areas. As Eric Siegel, the guy who invented predictive analytics said, he said, predictive analytics is the mixture of art and science. It needs human creativity to create hypotheses that then the predictive analytics engine can explore. And it's that matchup that makes this so powerful. And it's exactly the same here. We need to get great testers, but we need to give them these AI-powered, model-based testing-powered tools to scale up to the speed of DevOps. And that's how we get that mixture of intelligence and speed. So thank you very much. That's my whirlwind introduction to customer-driven testing. Hopefully you see how that ties into what Greg was talking about and the research that Justin was talking about earlier, and has given you some ideas about maybe how you can rethink your testing. And if that sounds interesting, please definitely get in touch with us. We'd love to talk more. So I think that's the end of the main agenda. So thank you very much, but I think we do have a few minutes for some questions. So let's go to that. Great. So we've had quite a lot of questions, so just flicking through them. There's a lot of people asking early on in the presentation about recent advances in how we develop software. On the one hand is making us release faster and do more testing, but testing's becoming slower, and that's often seen as a blocker to continuous delivery. So practically, how can we solve this other than saying start testing early or shift left, which I agree are very much kind of easy trite statements. Look, hopefully some of my presentation just then actually answered that question. For me, I think we need to, I think when people think about test automation technology, they think of effectively an API that lets you get and set properties on UI objects or on an API or something, and raise events. It's the equivalent of assembly language back in the 1960s. I think testers are stuck with 1960s technology for test automation. And I think the key is to move on to higher generation languages, model-based testing, auto-generation, self-healing, and I think we've got all the technologies for that today, as I sort of alluded to there, and certainly a lot of, we're working with a lot of pretty innovative companies doing something there. So I think it's all about moving to high-level technologies and not getting caught with these kind of low-level frameworks. Justin, I know you've done a lot of work on this, though, so why don't you talk about it?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is I'm not going to say something as simple as shift left, but I think the thinking has to start at the left. You need to design your approach to testing as part of designing the application, as part of the original development, so that you end up taking a comprehensive and an integrated view of the testing challenge. A lot of the time that is lost in testing is because testing is done in a balkanized way, separate testing for separate pieces, separate test data for separate bits of testing. So you need to have a comprehensive overview. Part of that comprehensive overview is seeing the wood from the trees. So prioritize what gets tested. Just because you have the testing capability, it doesn't make sense to test and retest everything frequently. So that prioritization, and then of course use tools that can automate testing in an integrated way. And clearly I'm going to say that would include your tools, Anthony, but think about it as a comprehensive challenge, not as a balkanized local challenge.
Yeah, no, that's totally agree there. Couple of actually, someone's asked two questions here. That someone said, would you say GUI enhancements are released more often than core business processing? I'd say by and large, yes. I mean, I think GUI I don't like to get into GUI specifically, but I think user bit limiting, but I think user experience, user flow, I think those changes happen a lot more frequently and certainly happen a lot more rapidly. And I think that's often those things that get commented on the App Store that people want to respond to quickly, whereas I think back-end infrastructure does change more slowly. I do think, as I've thought for over 20 years, that the software world loves to talk about layers and layers of abstraction, and almost never is that really true. Almost any interesting functionality is a vertical slice through all the layers. I mean, if you think about anything on a phone, web browsing, mapping, went down to the GPS, email had to go down to the bearer level. Interesting things are usually slices. So I think trying to be overly layered about it is quite dangerous. And that's why I think end-to-end testing is super important. There was a follow-up, which was, we talked about how you need testers, you need intelligent testers to guide the AI. And someone's asking for examples. I think it might sound like an easy thing to say. The examples I give are really around, I think, risk and importance. So, for example, a tester might highlight that certain components of the application are more risky than others based on their personal experience of either kind of doing some manual exploratory testing or just looking at support tickets. I think they may override the settings around what really matters to users due to some out-of-band knowledge. So I think the way I really see it is, I think if I think about software as a set of components, I think the tester goes through and sort of, I see them as kind of shifting up and shifting down the relative weights of both the risk and the business importance of the that the AI should then go and investigate. Two more quick questions. Apologies, getting loads of questions, and we should have booked more time for questions. This is great. Someone's asking, is there a path to get to a mature capability that achieves high volume of automation and AI? What is it? It's a really interesting question, because I think the problem is, people have very mature, often manual testing processes, maybe based around sort of an HP ALM style test case model. And then they see all these whizzy AI technologies that are dynamically creating test cases on the fly, and they just don't fit together. So it makes it very difficult for people to have a gentle path towards, and someone coming up to you and saying, hey, just chuck out all your work for the last 10 years and come to the within you world is hard. So I think the way I see that path is where you stick with what you've traditionally done, but you use the new technology. The new technologies have to find a way to make themselves kind of make sense in the old framework. So, you know, for example, we'll often auto-generate 100 sort of tests from an AI model, and then use those as the kind of basic smoke test, and that's sort of that then you can link back into your requirements in an HP world. So you sort of do that, and then use the additional stuff more as upside on the testing. And then I think as people get more comfortable that the intelligent levels and the new technologies are being effective, and they're happy releasing that control a bit, you can start to move across. So I think it's all about providing people where the new technologies are providing incremental value on top of the old stuff, and you can report on it all together. All right. One more here. What are the key KPIs you suggest to measure ROI of QA in a program organization, particularly when organizations are on a DevOps journey? Wow, that's a great question. There's a whole webinar there, but I think I know Greg talked about that a bit earlier, so I think I'll pass to him. Greg, do you have your sort of 3 top KPIs that you would suggest to people to measure the ROI of testing in QA?
I actually was talking about how very little we have in that space, and it's really hard for us to. So I would be very keen to find out from someone like Justin maybe answering that question. Yeah. One thing I would say that there's been kind of a set of a couple of metrics we've used that in the past and looked at were defect escape, and we looked at the defect escape rate for pre-production as well as production environments. So that's kind of giving you certain indication if you have a quite mature teams where it's easy to measure the effort of testing, then you can try to get some correlation between those 2 metrics. But overall, I have to say that I'm also fishing for ideas in that space. So I might be actually bouncing it to Justin to give us some ideas, if you don't mind.
Good. Well, he's texting me saying, I've got an answer. So off you go, Justin.
So I recognize this problem, and actually I've been working with a few figures in the industry over the last year. I think it's fair to say that we all have to measure expenditure, so everybody knows the investment, whether it's expressed as time or hard cash. But in quality, it's a bit like in marketing. It's kind of hard to measure the return. We've been developing some KPIs with a number of financial institutions, including with the Bank of England, looking at the ratios. What is the proportion of time and effort and spent on testing, spent on quality, and spent critically on remediation? And then how does that relate to in-source versus outsource spend? How does that relate to defects and the ratio of defects escaping to production as opposed to captured by the net of QA? And how does that relate to the degree of project overrun? We're actually running a proof of concept. If anybody's interested in understanding more about the proof of concept, I'd be happy to take that offline. And hoping to put that into production later in the year, precisely to create these measures of what good looks like. Because it's very clear that we measure a lot of things, but we don't have that comprehensive view of what does good look like on quality. When am I spending the right amount of time and effort and money? So that's something we're excited to be working on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everyone, for giving up your time to join us today. Hopefully, you found that both sort of interesting from a vision perspective, but also some useful stuff you can take straight back into your testing this morning or this afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please get in touch with us here at Eggplant or Justin at QA Media. We'd love to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.